Hi, I just wanted to tell you that I'm Gary Ann. I'm excavating my husband Bill this morning using his Zoom account, so I am here.
Okay. Hi, Gary Ann. If you want to get started, I believe Megan has set up the screen share. So if you want to, we're all going to introduce ourselves this morning. And so if you just want to take a minute to introduce yourself, and then I'll just keep time and we'll go that way. And then we'll all do questions at the end. So if you have a question for one of our presenters, please wait till we're all finished.
Thank you. My name is Gary Ann Chatswald. I'm an independent scholar. I live in West Dundee, Illinois. I have graduate degrees in library science and religious studies, and I also have a graduate certificate in gynecology. I've been fascinated with the influenza pandemic of 1918 since I was a preteen. My mother told me about it. This is the sixth paper I presented on the subject. So let's get started. On Sunday, October 5th, 1918, Henry Fulton, a soldier on furlough from Camp Funston, East Central Kansas, arrived at the home of his in-laws, Mr. and Mrs. Charles Morgan. 36 hours after his arrival, he became ill with influenza. A little later, his wife became ill, followed by the nurse who was caring for her, and by two of the younger Morgan children. The Morgan home was quarantined and all possible precautionary measures taken to guard against the spread of the disease. The Morgan home was located in Arma, one of several established communities, which, along with a frequently varying number of mining camps, dotted Crawford and neighboring Cherokee counties in the coal-rich region along the Missouri border in the southeastern corner of Kansas. These communities were comprised largely of miners and their families who either were immigrants or the descendants of immigrants from Eastern and Southeastern Europe. As a result, the region had become known as the Little Balkans. The first underground mine shaft in rear Pittsburgh coal seam in Crawford and Cherokee counties was completed in 1874. During the next three-quarters of a century, 290 significant mines and numerous small underground mines called biggies were mined in the area. This resulted in the establishment of numerous coal camps in which miners lived. A few of these coal camps became towns and cities, including the Crawford County communities of Arma, Frontenac, Mulberry, and the largest settlement, the city of Pittsburgh. Although there was some surface or strip mining, most of the mines were deep shaft mines, in which miners worked in close quarters with poor ventilation. In 1918, the demand for coal to support the war effort made Crawford County a center of mining activity. Consequently, when influenza arrived in October, there was concern. Whether that concern was more for the well-being of the miners or for mine production is open to debate. On October 9th, 3 days after the Pittsburgh newspaper, the headlights printed the news of influenza in the Fulton and Morgan families. Samuel J. Crumbine, MD, chairman of the Kansas State Health Department, and later a recognized pioneer in the field of public health, announced, "The epidemic is here. There's no use trying to evade it. The only thing to do to prevent it is to spread it as much as possible by preventing public gatherings." The Crawford County Board of Health responded by immediately issuing an order closing all schools, churches, Sunday schools, picture shows, and all other public assemblies until further notice. Public funerals were also banned. In Pittsburgh, the county's commercial center, Dr. A.J. Dodds, the city physician, convened a meeting of local physicians at which it was agreed that restrictions should be imposed, even though there were only 20 cases in Pittsburgh at the time. Pittsburgh Mayor Oliver P. Jones issued a more detailed proclamation than the one issued by the county, closing schools and any meetings of all public bodies, assemblies, lodges, churches, congregations, gospel gatherings, and any and all organizations, theaters, and shows. There were, however, some exceptions. Not more than 25 persons, exclusive of employees of industrial and mercantile establishments, shall be permitted to gather together in any public or private building place. The proclamation stated that this did not apply to public conveyance, and this is important. On October 12th, with few new cases in Pittsburgh, the hopeful Mayor Jones noted that Pittsburgh has complied with the closing orders splendidly. The headline stated, "Never before has a public health regulation met with such unquestioning obedience." Jones attributed this cooperation to people's having become accustomed to various regulations related to World War I. He didn't think that this would have been possible before what he termed as the war training. The newspaper further noted that the population individually is on guard against influenza. The sale of Listerine and other preventatives has been enormous. That fragrant home remedy of other years, assafoetida, has come out of retirement and is being used internally and externally. Anti-spitting cards were distributed yesterday by the health department. These cards call attention to the fact that city ordinance imposes a fine of $1 to $25 for spitting on sidewalks or on the floors of public buildings. Indiscriminate expectoration is recognized as one of the chief avenues of spreading disease. In spite of all efforts to control it, influenza continued to spread throughout the county. As Mayor Jones was praising the cooperation in Pittsburgh, Headlight reported that there had been more cases in Arma and 3 deaths from influenza and 75 other possible cases of influenza in the mining community of Mulberry. Cases were also reported in the county seat of Gerard, in several mining camps, and even in individual homes on the rural mail route north of Pittsburgh. The pages of the local newspapers are filled with accounts of influenza among people who traveled great distances to attend the funerals of relatives and friends who had died of influenza. Influenza was such a dominant cause of death that the editor of the Mulberry News felt it necessary to specify that a Mrs. Frances Elliott had died from tuberculosis and not from influenza. On October 15th, the Mulberry News reported that coal production was down in the North Coalfield because of miners being sick or having to care for family members who had the flu. The news complained that large numbers of influenza cases were being identified as people from Mulberry, and they were actually from coal camps outside the town. They attributed this to Mulberry being a community center for a great portion of its populous North Coalfield, and the only place convenient where there are physicians and undertakers. The Mulberry paper's contention was confirmed when Lieutenant Charles C. Shelton from the United States Army Medical Corps visited and determined that most of the serious cases were actually from the mining camps outside of Mulberry and not from Mulberry itself. He recommended that barbers wear masks while working, but otherwise believed all necessary precautions were already being taken. According to the Pittsburgh Weekly Headlight, plans were underway for better regulation in the camp. It's not clear what those better regulation plans were, but since the article includes a statement from the captain of the Pittsburgh State Guards that there had been no official call for guardsmen to enforce closure and isolation regulations, one can probably assume that that was at least one of the possibilities. On October 14th, Dr. Crumbine identified Crawford County as the seat of the most severe epidemic in the state. He noted that the county had reported 300 cases at one time and that it had been averaging 100 cases a day since. He attributed the high number of cases to the county's being in a thickly populated mining section of the state. Like many cities and towns, Pittsburgh found it necessary to set up a temporary hospital to house influenza victims. The YMCA was proposed as the site of the infirmary, and the wise director said that if the situation demanded it, they would turn the building over to the city, but noted that using the building for the infirmary would require the ejectment of men who were rooming there, in addition to a thorough cleaning of the building once the epidemic had ended. They suggested that the city look elsewhere. In response, the city rented an unoccupied rooming house to house the temporary facility. However, the local Red Cross Influenza Committee found the rooming house and its furnishings unsuitable for the purpose, even though it had been approved by local physicians. The city decided to use the first location while they negotiated a site at another rooming house, but not with Red Cross approval. But the YMCA was quickly identified as the only practical solution to the need for an infirmary, and a contract was signed for the city to rent the building for $750 a month. The YMCA demanded the payment in cash as the organization's board didn't want the $750 applied to an outstanding $900 water bill that it owed the city and which it couldn't afford to pay at the time. Even though the state was making progress in slowing the spread of influenza, on October 25th, the closing order was extended a week. The state ban was finally lifted on November 2nd, but Crawford County Board of Health and the Pittsburgh Health Department decided that it was necessary to extend the ban in the county for at least a week. The extended ban included overcrowded streetcars and political meetings that might have been scheduled prior to the upcoming November election. In addition, all stores and business houses except drugstores and restaurants were ordered to close at 6 p.m. The nature of the mining industry probably contributed to the difficulty in controlling the spread of influenza. Old mines were frequently being abandoned and new ones dug. When this happened, miners often moved from camp to camp as work demanded. By 1918, the railroad had made these moves less necessary, as miners could live in the towns that had grown up around some of the mines and commute to work via the Joplin and Pittsburgh Electric Railway. Consequently, miners were constantly traveling about the county to and from work. It was particularly difficult for Pittsburgh to isolate itself from exposure to the epidemics that was raging elsewhere in the county, not only because it was a commercial business center with several plants manufacturing equipment for the mining industry, but it was also home to a normal school that had a student on a training corps, at least 12 members of which contracted influenza. The city was also home to Mount Carmel Hospital, originally founded in 1901 by the Mount Carmel Coal Company to treat its employees. During the pandemic, the approximately 50-bed facility became a destination for senior people both inside and outside the city. The Mulberry newspaper reported that the Mulberry Hardware Company, which the newspaper referred to as the Mulberry Hardware and Undertaking Company, ran an ambulance service that took patients to Pittsburgh for care. In reporting deaths in the Pittsburgh registration district for the month of October, the city clerk noted that of the 28 deaths that attributed to influenza, 12 were from outside Pittsburgh, some even from outside Crawford County, who had been brought to the hospital for treatment. It's also apparent that people from outside Pittsburgh were being admitted to the infirmary at the YMCA. Less than a month after the city issued a proclamation exempting rail cars from occupancy limits, the County Board of Health restricted occupancy of rail cars to the seating capacity, with exception made for morning and evening hours when the rails were used to transport miners to and from work, because the railway does not have enough cars to carry miners to and from work without filling the cars beyond capacity. In order to enforce the order against overcrowding rail cars, the County Health Department stationed an officer at one of the stations on Saturday for the payday rush hour when cars were usually filled beyond capacity. The officer was to stop admitting people to the cars when all seats were filled. On November 14th, State Health Director Trumby noted that conditions were improving statewide, except in Crawford and Cherokee counties, where a second wave of the epidemic had appeared with scores of new cases. He promised to send help. At the time of the pandemic, Kansas was seriously short of physicians, none including serving in the military. But using the Kansas share of an emergency appropriation from the U.S. Congress, Trumby was able to secure the services of 8 physicians from eastern Kansas and western Missouri to assist in underserved areas. Among the help was Lieutenant Eleanor Ernest of the United States Public Health Service, a woman physician. With the shortage of male physicians due to men serving in the military, World War I was a time of advancement for women physicians. It's possible that the health department might have considered Crawford County friendlier to women physicians in some places due to its associations with the labor and socialist movement in which women often held responsible positions. At least one conference of socialist women was held in Gerard, the county seat of Crawford County. It's worth noting that Crawford County was the site of considerable labor activism. There were over 364 strikes in Kansas mines between April 1916 and December 1918. And it had a national reputation as a center of socialist activities. The widely circulated socialist periodical appealed to the many socialist pamphlets published in the county seat, Gerard. The perennial socialist presidential candidate Eugene B. Debs lived in Gerard, and Crawford County was one of the very few counties that Debs carried in the 1912 presidential election. Since requiring stores to close early and not have the desired effect of keeping people apart, it had the opposite effect of causing congestion during the hours the stores were open. The city adopted an alternative plan limiting the number of people who could be in the store at one time. How effective this measure was is uncertain since it was up to the merchants to monitor the store occupancy. By December 27th, the Board of Health in Pittsburgh was finally able to allow schools, churches, and theaters to reopen. 1919 saw things return to some semblance of normal, and coal production began to decline, partly to decrease demand as the war ended, partly due to a return to the strikes that had previously plagued the industry, but mainly due to the coal industry falling into a permanent decline. By the early 1930s, almost all mining was surface and strip mining. By 1970, most of the mines had closed. The last mine closed in 1997. Along with the closure of the mines, much has changed in Crawford County. Though the county still celebrates its heritage in such events as Little Balkan Days at Pittsburgh and the annual Festa Italiana, the Taste of Nations at Frontenac, Crawford County has experienced approximately 37% declining population, and the population has become more urban. Approximately 51% of the population living in Pittsburgh in 2010 versus 29% in 1920. The tiny Mount Carmel Hospital has grown to nearly 200 beds with state-of-the-art equipment and a pharmacy, and is now part of the Via Christi health system. The name was changed to Via Christi in 2009 with its street address 1 Mount Carmel Way, left to preserve a vestige of its former identity. The YMCA apparently found a way to pay its water bill, as the Pittsburgh facility is now an active provider of family fitness programs and such things as child care, dance classes, and youth sports programs. Today, the major employer in Crawford County is government, much of it associated with Pittsburgh State University, Go Gorillas, with its approximately 7,500 students, approximately 3 times the number of enrollment in 1918. Consequently, when the coronavirus pandemic of 2020 struck, things are very different than they were in 1918. According to the January 2021 quarterly report of Pittsburgh's Director of Economic Development and the Pittsburgh State University Chief Strategy Officer, the The unemployment rate in Pittsburgh was a 20-year low at 3.2% in March 2020 when the virus hit. It then spiked to 9% the following month. However, by December, the rate was down to 3.5%, partly due to nearly $20 million from the federal payroll protection plan providing support for 2,000 jobs. The city was looking forward to a full recovery in 2021 with 2 new businesses already scheduled to open. A Dairy Queen and a new business on South Broadway identified only as being near Braun. Obviously, they love their ice cream in Pittsburgh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gary Ann. Up next is Grace Moore of Wayne State University.
Okay, just share my screen. Okay, move this. Minimize up top. Oh, my name is Grace Moore. I am a joint master's in public history and master's of library information science and archival administration student at Wayne State University. And I'm also a current intern at the Levin Center at Wayne Law School. And I will be presenting on the social aspect of quarantine from tuberculosis to COVID-19. So first, a brief history of tuberculosis. The most common type is pulmonary tuberculosis. It is of the lungs, and it's been around for thousands of years, and the signature, it's disguised itself as a lot of things, but the thing that it's most known for is that it's a killer. If you get it, you'll most likely die. So when the Industrial Revolution came around and people flocked to the cities and they lived in tenements and crowded conditions and unsanitary conditions, it created the perfect breeding grounds for tuberculosis. And so it really thrived, and people couldn't afford to take work off, and it spread at work, it spread at home, and made conditions really, really bad. So sanatoria started to crop up. They're basically like retreats. It was thought that the fresh air would be good for the lungs. So in 1854, the first one was founded in Germany. Edward Trudeau founded the first one in the US in 1884. He got tuberculosis when he was nursing his brother who died of it. And he famously said, "I had consumption, the most fatal of diseases. It meant death, and I had never thought of death before. Was I ready to die? How could I tell my wife?" In the late 19th century. So he had remembered a trip he went to, where he had taken to the mountains, and the fresh air he experienced there. So he went there again and immediately felt better. So that, and hearing about the sanitarium in Germany, and he decided to create his own. So in 1884, he opened the Adirondack Cottage Sanatorium at Saranac Lake in New York. Within 25 years, there were over 400 in the US, and they were opened for the purpose of the cleaner air. That they quarantined people was an accident. It did help that it helped stop the spread of tuberculosis. And in 1949, Salman Waxman discovered streptomycin, which ended up helping to cure tuberculosis. So I will be using Heights Tuberculosis Sanatorium as a case study. It is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and where it is. It was opened in 1911, closed in funded by Marquette County. It's self-sustaining and modeled after Edward Trudeau's. It even had its own chickens. Doctors lived on site giving patients 24-hour care. It originally only housed 18 patients. It soon needed to expand because 300 people a year were getting tuberculosis in the Upper Peninsula alone. So 18 people wasn't quite enough to house. So some demographic data extracted from the first 5 years of patient data from 1911 to end of 19. There were 176 patients. In 1910, there was a huge copper mining, so there were a lot of immigrants. So some of the ethnicity data that I got, the nationality of the patients, there were 71 Finnish, 31 Swedish people, 91 English, 15 French, 7 German, 7 Irish, but only 4 American born. Of the occupations, there was only 1 lawyer, but 31 miners, 25 laborers, 19 housewives, 6 maids, 27 children, both in school and not, and the rest were miscellaneous, mostly, but a few white collar jobs. So that shows that a lot of more low wage immigrant, low socioeconomic people were using sanatoriums, and that was a lot of the people that were living in the UP at the time. There were 4 payment options to stay at sanatoria. You could pay in full. You could have your insurance, if you were lucky enough to have it at the time, pay for you. You could petition your state to pay for your stay, or you could do chores to earn your stay. It was self-sustaining, so you could take care of the chickens. And so needless to say, as most people couldn't afford insurance or to pay, they chose the last 2 options, meaning that sanatoria were sanctuaries for the poor. So COVID-19 tuberculosis. In the 1880s, germ theory came about, but people didn't quite understand it. There was a story about a New York hospital where a man went in and was given a cup and a blanket that had been used by hundreds of men before him, and he just left because it was disgusting. So today we have antibiotics and modern medicine. Things have improved drastically, and COVID-19 hit. And COVID-19 and tuberculosis are both spread through the air, and they are lung-based diseases, and they both killed doctors, and they took us all by storm. And much like even with all our modern medicine, we were still unprepared. We had insufficient equipment. Even with all these advances, we ended up having to use quarantine as one of our main defenses, because it ended up being one of the same situations. Because even though it was an unintentional solution for tuberculosis, it ended up being one of the same situations, it being very comparable. Demographics from the CDC about COVID-19. It should be noted first that this is only 62% reporting on race and ethnicity. And you'll notice white and non-Hispanic is the far right, the darker pink is the population, percent of population. So white non-Hispanic is 60% of the population. And the purple on the left is the case rate, with the middle being percent of deaths. So the case rate is less than the population for white, at about 10% less. But it's a lot. It's 50% of the cases were from white non-Hispanic. So with 50% of those cases being white non-Hispanic, you'd think that you might wonder why. Well, obviously it's because a lot of our population is mostly white. I would also contribute it to speculatively the anti-vaccine movement. And I would also like to point your attention to the fact that the Hispanic and Latinx population is only 18.45% of our population reported. And they have a 28.9% case rate, which means that they have a significantly higher case rate than they are a part of our population, which means that they are, and this is only 62% reporting, which means that there's a undocumented part of our population that is Latinx. So there's likely a percent of our cases that are undocumented, which means that there's likely even more cases undocumented that are Latinx, meaning that this data is showing that already disadvantaged populations are even more at risk for COVID-19 than white population, the white population in the United States. So who's left behind? Sanatoria were not perfect. They didn't have modern medicine. They were sanctuaries for the poor. There was one flaw in the system, and that is that there wasn't any kind of workers' compensation for when for families left behind. Say a married man, ignore my cat, married man went to a sanatorium, his family wouldn't
Eisler of Indiana University, Bloomington.
Sort of. So a slight miscommunication. I am actually a philanthropic studies student at IUPUI, which is Indianapolis. It's where the school is located in the IU system. My minor field is in folklore, which is in Bloomington, and that's where I did my undergrad. So as I said, I'm a philanthropic studies scholar, and my minor field and my BA are in folklore, as well as a double major in undergrad of religious studies. And I have a master's of public administration from the University of Utah. So a lot of what I'm concerned about and what I'm interested in is the stories that we tell each other and how it relates to our charity, our philanthropy, our giving, and our understanding of what's happening in the world. So please forgive me as I share my screen and you get to see the wonderful background of my very sweet dog. Let me make sure I've got the right screen to share. There we go. All right. Can I get a quick thumbs up that you guys can see my presentation? Thank you, Allie. So as I said here, I am interested in looking at Midwestern asylums and how folklore informs our perspective of what's happening or occurring in history. Note that there are no graphic images in this presentation. I know when we talk about asylums, things can get pretty dark, and a mentor that I value a lot, historian and anthropologist Paul Mullins, decided not to show these types of images in his lectures, and I'm going to follow his lead. So first, I want to start you out with a story. In York, Pennsylvania, there's an area named Hellman Township. According to legend, you can find the 7 gates of hell down Old Trout Run Road. One gate is only visible at sunrise, another gate to a property, and the rest are invisible. Those who pass through all 7 gates may be taken straight to hell. Back in the 19th century, the area was a site of a former insane asylum. One night, while many patients slept, the asylum caught fire and the mayhem and violent inmates escaped. Some say that the gates of hell caught and trapped them. Others say that the inmates escaped and still roam the area, murdering unsuspecting townsfolk. So according to one local article, this story can be traced back to 1963, even possibly earlier. However, local records show that there was never any asylum located in Hellman Township, Pennsylvania, nor is there an existence of Trout Run Road. So these things that we would objectively call facts were pieces of truth, kernels, nuggets of truth in our legends seem not to be factual. And you may be asking yourself, why is a philanthropic studies scholar telling me about ghost stories at a history conference? And that, I have to tell you, is a really great question. So contemporary legends like these can really help us understand the communities that produce these stories, their value systems, and unlike what we hope historical facts do, they're prone to change over time. I started digging into a few questions about legends and asylums and their links to the stories and what they tell us about this major philanthropic movement in the United States and abroad. This very historical, easy to place, easy to see a timeline of. So as I'm researching, I have some questions about what are these changes in our stories over time? How do they reflect our understanding of public spaces? Kind of brings in questions of civil society, which in philanthropy, that's a major point of understanding for us. How do people collectively work together to make something happen? And do changing ideas of philanthropy seem to change in our contemporary legends? First, I took a look at a variety of sources on asylums, and just to get a better understanding of the movement, the structures that existed, the political and social forces behind them, and interpret their influences in particularly the Midwest. I also looked at a lot of folklore scholarship to better understand interpretations of these types of stories, particularly about patients and grounds of mental institutions. And then I looked mostly at Central State here in Indianapolis, which was closed in 1994. It opened in 1848. It's on our near west side of the city. It's in the city limits. It's these big, beautiful grounds, and only a few of the buildings remain. And of course, I looked at tons and tons of legends themselves. This was a bit tricky because our archives are closed, but luckily many contemporary versions of legends are shared on TikTok and Reddit and YouTube and podcasts and anywhere else you can think where people are telling stories to each other. So I didn't have to lose it all during the pandemic. And you can already sense the differences that will arise when we look at these two very different types of sources. Folklorists deal in belief over facts and expressive forms of folklore in contemporary media. So trying to put a narrative to these malleable stories, I hope could help us get a better understanding of these structures and these systems that were located in the Midwest. So asylums in history. With my background in folklore, you can probably imagine what drew me to these spooky halls of mental institutions, but it was the philanthropic history that kept me interested. If you're anything like me, you maybe are only familiar with the crumbling Victorian buildings that inspire horror stories and not the picturesque grounds that really represented an innovative solution to a changing society. As Grace has mentioned, as I'm sure we're going to hear about throughout this few days of conference, the institutions were founded by charity organizations in many cases, and lots of poor or lower class individuals ended up there. It was a mix of poverty and morality, which at the time went very closely together and influenced the philanthropy that was occurring in these city spaces at this time. When first built, these institutions had middle-class furnishings. They were heated, they had regular meals, the staff was set up in a way to reflect a paternalistic family. So as Grace mentioned, some people at these places experienced a level of life and comfort and care that they had never experienced before. They attempted to care for these members of society that had lost their support structures in changing cityscapes. The industrial era, people are moving to cities. They're not in their close networks and towns and families anymore. So prisons and institutions arose in very similar timelines to combat this fear that community and church and family were undermined in a new social system, it seemed to be reinforced that criminality and insanity seemed to be on the rise. When, if we look at history and if we look at Elizabethan poor laws and Atlantic influences on community care, we could tell that sometimes these people weren't out and about in big individual societies. So when we moved into cities, it seemed like there were more people who needed to be taken care of than what it felt like before. This reinforced a deeply moral argument about wealth and living in cities and living in community. So the Midwest served as a really big hub of these locations, partially because of the time period. As states are being founded and westward expansion is happening, that's when asylums and institutions were very popular. So it makes sense that they kind of arrived here. But they also had space. If you look at a city like Boston, you're not going to find an institution in the city limits because there wasn't room yet. In the Midwest, we're seeing these expansions, and curiously, these sanatoriums and these institutions were found very close to city limits. They were focused on cures, but it became much more difficult as funding was cut, as housing and budgetary decisions influenced the history of these places. And you may be thinking, cool, asylums, get it. What are you hoping to gain from stories and an understanding of history through folklore, which in common usage, folklore is often meant to be untrue. Here are some basics about folklore and a folklorist approach to storytelling that might help clear that up. So in that first box, you can see there are 3 narrative types: a myth, a legend, and a folktale. William Bascom decided, hey, I can put these 3 things in conversation and figure out what are their relationships to each other. So for us, a legend is a story that is told to be fact, presented as fact. It covers a recent past. It can be secular or sacred. So legends kind of walk the line between myth and folktale sometimes, and that the principal characters are often human. So what that tells us is these stories about asylums, we're dealing with contemporary legends. They're things that are being shared right now and are changing right now. The third box there, a friend of a friend. There is a verbal tick that happens in storytelling. If you hear a story start with, did you hear the one about? Or my friend's friend, my friend of a friend. I'm trying to establish a social connection that's close enough that you believe me, right? So now we're seeing these stories that are rooted in truth. They're still being told, and they're presented almost with the social capital argument of, well, it didn't happen to me and it didn't happen to my friend, but it happened to my friend's friend. So there's some reliability there. And when we think about the functions, also William Bascom, you can tell he's a big leader in the field, one of those really great white guys who just said a bunch of things and then now everybody listens to it. So while we're, as a field, making sure that we're reevaluating some of those early arguments and the early structures to make sure that they are not unduly influenced by things like race and class and all of that. William Bascom did present the functions of narrative types. He boiled them down to entertainment. They validate culture, they educate, and they apply social pressure. So now you know enough about folklore to be dangerous. And hopefully you can see how legends might tell us about the historical perspective that we're seeing around these institutions and asylums here in the Midwest. With this short time that we have left, I know I've got about 4 minutes, Allie, but we can see a legend here, presented here. You've probably heard this. The guy with a hook attacks some teens who are out necking in the woods. This story has been around for many decades. It's still going on, but I noticed something happening here. This legend, which I've heard a lot, really places the asylum as a secondary location. It It is not where our action is happening in this story. And then if we look at jumping forward about 45 years, as we casually do, Utah State University is a large folklore school as well. And so they have great archives. Found in this archive, not quite in the Midwest, but it definitely reflects what is happening in stories there. This is a story of a doctor, a psychiatrist who worked at a mental hospital and felt huge feelings of guilt and ended up killing himself. And the legend that revolves around this occurrence is that the doctor becomes a morally questionable character, whereas before, the morally questionable character was the person who was in the asylum, the person who got thrown behind those locked doors and was viewed as a criminal. And across 40, 45 years, as our institutions are closing, our legends become more traditional ghost stories than contemporary legends. When I say contemporary legends, you may be more familiar with the term urban legend. Contemporary legend is kind of an updating of that term because these stories don't always happen in cities. So we're seeing these stories where our legends are moving out of contemporary and into traditional. Ghosts have become the principal characters instead of violent criminals. And the patient is no longer feared to come into and disrupt your safe space, but rather we're moving toward legend tripping. People are going to these places to experience something. They're trying to make themselves a part of the story. So they're still engaging with a physical space in our Midwestern landscape. Our stories are predicting this space, and you may say, okay, great, space, got it. As a philanthropic scholar, the interaction of place and segregation are really important to ideas of networking and civil society. So that's interesting. I am now seeing these stories shift from the moral value of patients to the moral value of those who were treated unfairly. Also, we're moving from a man character, a threatening male character, to almost a genderless being. We're seeing shadow people in these places. The more and more I try to categorize and classify these stories, I realized that in the archetypal structures of folklore, like, where am I going to put this? Where does it occur? What are the motifs that happen in similar stories? I started to realize many of these stories are actually about the automobile. They're stories of safety and sexual morality used to teach teenagers. So less and less these stories are telling us about the types of people in institutions. And now they're beginning to move from questions of safety to more conversations of trauma and loss and remembering things that our philanthropic selves, our better selves tried to do that still ended up kind of icky. So instead of calling this a transition in our stories, these are two completely different types of stories. In a different timeline, in a different history, our stories have grown differently. And that's what I'm seeing that's exciting about our mental institutions and these spaces that may be closing. As you enjoy this really terrible chart as I fly through it, what I started to plot on a timeline was, okay, where are these institutions happening? Where are systems of reform happening? And what do our stories look like? If you can see my mouse here, dangerous men, change toward escaped madmen. And then we kind of get to stories of tortured souls. So what happened in this space? It seems like we might draw a parallel to our rise of community care. So ideas of integration and taking those people that we're afraid of out of isolation have major impacts for the stories that we tell. What does this have to say about Midwestern history? Well, it's an important part of history because we're seeing this tie to the car. We know that Midwestern history has been very much influenced by the car, right? Crabgrass nation. People moved out into suburbs. We lost part of our community. Can our stories help us trace that movement and the moral judgment of leaving urban centers and moving into suburbs? It also follows that we can take this leap and talk about Tocquevillian understandings of civil society, and that supports the philanthropic stories that we're creating. So as I wrap it up, I know I'm like 2 minutes too long, Allie, I'm sorry. But as I think about future research and kind of discuss this, what I'm seeing is that folklore stories are told from one person to another. They evolve over time, and they often forget the intentions or focus in a final version. What we see is that the asylums declined and they resorted to physical restraints. And these are things that are profoundly un-American. We don't like our freedoms taken away. So our stories changed to remember atrocities and traumas inflicted on people that we see as a moral mandate to care for. So our nation can think of nothing worse. Our historians can dig through archives and uncover understandings of why asylums evolved as they did. But what history can separate is how the actual historical figures have become our ghosts. And I argue rather optimistically that these ghost stories and contemporary legends evolved from morality tales and became cultural memory to ensure that we never do this again. And what higher philanthropy is there than to keep our historical shortcomings from repeatedly hurting society's most vulnerable members? That's what I got for you today.
All right, thanks, Megan. I am Allie Penn, and I am last, but of course not least. And I'm a PhD student at Wayne State University, and thank you for joining us today. So my presentation focuses on Laura Mabel Davis, who was a nurse anesthetist at the University of Michigan. I discovered her through the pages of her father's lighthouse log. Transcribing the lighthouse log was a project of mine while I worked for the Michigan Iron Industry Museum, because the state of Michigan owns both of the lighthouses in Copper Harbor. And so, you can see on the map, Copper Harbor is sort of in the middle of nowhere, as I affectionately refer to it. But it was through the, detailed notes about the comings and goings of his daughter in the lighthouse log that I became determined to know more about this woman. And what I learned about her was the story of someone who was far ahead of her time, learning a science and a profession well before her male colleagues. The same woman, as well as her fellow female colleagues, were later pushed out of the field when male physicians sought to reclaim their profession. So Davis was born in Marquette, Michigan, which Grace pointed to earlier in her presentation. It's in the Upper Peninsula, and Davis spent her early years in Copper Harbor, Michigan on the map. In 1906, her father wrote in the lighthouse log that Laura Davis was accepted to the program at the University of Michigan, and she left the next day for Ann Arbor. So while she was a student at University of Michigan, she worked on various cases, and by February 1907, she was serving as the senior nurse on the ward at the University Hospital. Davis graduated in 1908 and returned to Michigan's Upper Peninsula, where she took a job as a nurse for one of the mines in the region. There, she treated miners and assisted with the public health education of miners that focused really on sanitation and prevention. She left her position with one of the mining companies to take a job with one of the railway company hospitals. So she was very early invested in industrial medicine. So this is a photo of the 1908 graduating class of the nursing school. The woman on the second from the left that the arrow is pointing to is Laura Mabel Davis. This is one of only 2 photos I've been able to find of her. And so for anyone who, studies women or like people in the past, it's so exciting when you finally find an image of your subject. And so that's what this was for me. So At the time, when Davis was learning anesthesia, there were not really any formal graduate training programs. The common practice was really for female nurses to form partnerships with male surgeons. And it was through this partnership that women were trained to do anesthesia, and then the surgeon didn't have to worry about anesthesia anymore. And so she, through this partnership, was able to develop her own method for administering anesthesia and really grow the profession of anesthesiology. So at the beginning, it was really the Mayo brothers at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota that, paved the way for women to have this career. They trained some of the first female anesthetists and continued to train them, up until like the 1920s, 1930s. So Davis went to study there in the summer of 1912. And that fall, she began working at the University of Michigan's hospital. The following year in 1913, Davis almost left her position at the University of Michigan. The pay was really minimal, as it was for nurses who worked at hospitals at that time. And Davis requested an increase. And the dean of the medical school was sort of flabbergasted, but also was like, we don't have any medicine to pay this woman, because that's how they saw her. And it was really 8 departments at the medical school who saw Davis's value and thought, we need to keep her, they offered up parts of their funding in order to pay for an increased salary for Davis. So she stayed. Additionally, she did attend one of the only existing graduate training programs in anesthesia at the postgraduate medical school and hospital in New York City in 1914. She actually requested funding from the University of Michigan to attend, but she was denied. And ultimately, she decided to go anyway because she wanted to learn. And so that's sort of, just an indication of how she was treated by this place. So Davis volunteered to go to France with the American Expeditionary Forces during World War I to assist at the war front. So she left in 1918. She volunteered with the base hospital out of Rochester, Minnesota, the Mayo Clinic, versus the one out of Ann Arbor with the University of Michigan. While she was there, she served as an anesthetist and ultimately, chief nurse at several of the hospitals there. She sort of moved around while she was in France. While Davis was in Europe, the University of Michigan decided to purchase new anesthesia equipment. However, due to her absence, the university decided that she should really be the one deciding this. It was her equipment. She was going to be the main person using it. And so ultimately, they delayed purchasing it until it returned. And I think this decision really highlights how crucial she was to the university, because it was simply a purchase of equipment, but they waited for her because they wanted it to be the way she wanted, because they knew her impact of having things set up the way that she wanted. So while Davis, when she returned from France, the university really saw the current trend of increasing these nurse anesthetist programs and decided to create one at the University of Michigan with Laura Davis at the helm. And so in 1919, she began training her first group of students. While she was the main trainer of the nurses, she ultimately did not grant the certificates. She sort of was just there as a bit of a figurehead. And then she wasn't allowed to train the physicians until, by 1922, she was like, I have so many surgeons asking me for classes, but I'm not allowed to teach them. And finally, the medical school allowed her to start teaching the male students. It's not really clear. I assume it has something to do with her gender as to why she was not deemed qualified to teach the male medical students, but the men dropped into her classes for the nurses so often that the medical school simply allowed it and started granting credits for attending Davis's lectures. By 1926, Davis's title was broadened. She was not only an instructor in anesthesia, but she was the chief anesthetist at the University Hospital. And she would hold both of these titles until 1939. So in 1929, there were concerns of mortality rates due to anesthesia at the university. Despite Davis's personal high success rate, the medical department decided to reorganize the department to find a man to lead the effort. And there was no discussion whatsoever about working with Davis in this effort. In 1930, additionally, Davis was excluded from a list of medical school instructors, indicating that she was not a medical doctor, so she shouldn't be on this list, despite the fact that she was one of the instructors at the school. In January 1938, Fenimore A. Davis was hired as an instructor of surgery and was placed in charge of the new Department of Anesthesia that was created within the Department of Surgery at the University of Michigan. Laura Davis was demoted to her old title of instructor of anesthesia. And so this was sort of really reflective of the change going on within the profession at large, but also, really poorly reflective of how they treated someone who was there for 30 years. Fenimore Davis actually received his initial training from Laura Davis at the University of Michigan. And it was this training that really sparked his interest in the field of anesthesia. However, the two of them really clashed. In a 1938 letter to the dean, Laura Davis reported, "He says he can make me do things instead of acting as one instructor to another and make the clinic run smoothly." Laura Davis also said that she believed that Fenimore Davis's presence was a good thing, but that he failed to recognize her expertise and her value to the department prior to his arrival. She reported, quote, "I tried to talk to him about it, and his only reply was that as head of anesthesia, he could make me do anything he wished, but that he condescended to ask my opinion where it wasn't necessary," unquote. And the two continued to fight for, over 3 years until Fenimore Davis was called into military service for World War II in 1941. And Laura Davis departed the school in 1943 after over 30 years of service. She reported that her father was ill and she moved to California to care for him, which was true. Her father was ill at the time, but I think it was also that her feelings were hurt after being at a school for so long and contributing so much to then have everything taken away from her so quickly. So this slide contains the very short obituary for Laura Mabel Davis. It doesn't reflect her career as a nurse anesthetist or an educator. It doesn't mention her military service. It simply notes that she was a daughter. So, despite over 30 years of work, her impact at the University of Michigan has sadly been long overlooked. It was devalued by her male colleagues and the university because Davis was simply a nurse. She exhibited this medical knowledge that was superior in many ways to that of her male professions, who deemed anesthesia for the longest time as below them. And she showcased a talent and efficiency that allowed the surgeons at the University of Michigan to develop their practice. Davis was an integral part of the University of Michigan, and her legacy was at first ignored, and now it's just unfortunately forgotten. And Davis is just one of these many women who were kept in subordinate roles and positions and made them seem less important compared to their male colleagues. Thank you. Okay, since I'm technically the moderator, if you guys have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I'll go first and ask Gary-Ann a question that I had about her presentation. So I've studied kind of, mining history in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and I was wondering, did the mining companies that you were talking about in Pennsylvania, did they play any active role in trying to combat the illness and trying to prevent the illness in any sort of way there?
I have no evidence that they actually did, because the nature of the mining in Crawford County, they were trying to produce as much coal as possible. And they actually opened up mines that had been closed and found coal wherever they could. And I think that the sheer numbers of people who were needed to do the mining made it difficult, if not impossible, for them to have kind of control, especially from in a short notice like this. This is a period of a few months. You can't really change the way mining was done, and when you have people crowded into the shaft mines, I think it was impossible for the companies to do anything if they wanted to. I think the real problem is the fact that they didn't really the transportation people didn't do anything about crowding miners on the trains during the time they were moving from mine to mine. People would get on trains with people who had other contacts within other communities, and that really caused the problem spreading.
Thank you. So Megan asked me a question in the chat. Who or what influenced Laura Mabel Davis to follow this path? Honestly, I don't really know. And frankly, judging on the timeline of Nurse Anesthesia, she was actually one of the forefront people when they formed the American Association of Nurse Anesthetists. She was actually nominated to be the vice president. And at the time the main president stepped down, she should have taken over as the main person. I'm not sure why she didn't lead the organization. That's not really clear to me. But I assume, she maybe got a taste for it when she was at the University of Michigan. Maybe there was a nurse anesthetist there, and then she decided to pursue this path. But it's not clear where she found anesthesia, just that she went down this rabbit hole very quickly.
I had a follow-up if you'll entertain it. Did you see anything in the logbooks or ancillary journals or anything? Like, what did her dad think of this whole thing? If that's the path of how you got to her, like, what was he thinking?
It's funny because, like, I think that's part of when you somehow become a biographer, people become very real to you. And her dad is very amusing because he will say witty, sarcastic things about other things, and then you have no idea what he thinks about anything else. And I think what's clear from the logbook is that when it comes to Laura, he's very proud of her because he constantly writes, about what she's doing and where she's working. And she came back every summer. She would take her 3 weeks of vacation to visit them. And at a certain point, she bought them a car and drove it up to Copper Harbor for them. And so I think that more than anything else, he's really proud of her. And I think that comes through. Okay. So Grace asked a question for Megan. No? Okay, we'll just ask it.
No, you missed it. It was from someone else.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Oh, Tim. Okay, got it. Asylums are mostly shut down today. This is for Megan, obviously. Are there any folkloric stories about psych wards in the same way there used to be stories about asylums?
Oh yeah, for sure. I don't encounter them very often, and that is an interesting gap that you pointed out. And I haven't written this up. I haven't attempted to publish this or anything yet. And so I really appreciate that comment about looking at modern wards. Just anecdotally, hospitals definitely have ghost stories and lore associated with them. Oftentimes, these kinds of stories are brought up at times of construction. People who research paranormal say, like, oh, you messed up the spirits and like all this, you ruffled their feathers, and now they want to tell you about why you should keep this place the same. Or I'm also a New Harmony researcher. I'm a graduate assistant dealing with New Harmony, so a utopian society in Indiana that didn't have an asylum. But you still have stories of people when things are under construction, like that brings a lot of things up. As someone with a historical perspective, part of me thinks that occurs because you're dredging up history, like you're literally undoing building, and you kind of have to confront that. So current hospitals have some challenges, unlike an asylum, which may be private property of the state, given that it's guarded based on city budgets a lot of the time. You could get there and you could spend time there. So a lot of the stories coming out of modern wards would have to be narrated by either patients who are there or medical staff who work there. So in my mind, you're seeing tension between privacy issues. So staff not being able to reveal anything based on HIPAA, right? You're still going to get some of these spooky stories, but what it speaks to for me as someone who is not only researching folklore in our stories, but also social movements within history, I think it speaks to a tellability issue where we've got these stories and who do we decide to listen to? Who do we decide is valid and informed enough that we should care about their story? So your question, while I don't think I'm answering it the way you intended or hoped, I hope I'm getting to something deeper, which is that to me, these stories reveal not just pain and trauma, but also who gets to speak for themselves and what do we believe about what they have to say. So sometimes these stories coming out of modern wards are going to be met with the same criticisms as before. Oh, those people are cuckoo. They don't know what they're talking about. And historically, we know people in asylums were not just people with severe mental illness. Sometimes it was anxiety. There were women who were caught in these systems for decades and continuing to receive medicine and care because they just kind of got structurally funneled into this system. And so for me, it's about an unpacking of who gets to say what to who and when. Tim, if I completely ignored the merit or intention of your question, please unmute and berate me. I'd love to hear it.
No, you answered the question. Thanks.
All right, Megan, you have another question. Could you tell us a little bit about your larger work from Amy?
Oh my gosh, yes, I'd love to. So as I said, I study philanthropic studies. We are a relatively new field. It's about 30 years old, and it's very interdisciplinary. So I get the chance to work with not only social psychologists and experimental researchers, but also economists and religious studies scholars. And a good friend of mine is very involved in service learning programs in collegiate environments. So got a big mess of things kind of coming at all of us at once. And what I've kind of carved out, the conversation that I want to have is about civil society and spaces of interaction as a philanthropic action for society. So Peyton and Moody define philanthropy. It's a really great place to start. They define it as voluntary action for the public good. So anything that any of us does out of the goodness of our hearts can be called philanthropy. So what I'm interested in is how folklore, whether it's stories or food or material culture, are wielded in conversations of giving to influence how we learn to give. So I'm very interested in, as someone mentioned, my sweet Bigfoot setup. I'm really interested in how characters like Bigfoot can lead people to environmental protections and philanthropy. I'm interested in how the food we choose to give to a food pantry may reflect the foodways and traditions that don't jive. If we're giving food that doesn't match the culture of the person receiving the food, do they know how to cook it? Do they know what tastes good, how to flavor it, all that kind of stuff? So more broadly, I'm interested in how stories, crafts, foods, and the things we learn from each other in community tell us about how we give.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to, I think, find us. I'm sure our emails are all somewhere. I would assume, wouldn't you guys? Probably. Yeah. All right. Thank you for joining us.